All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome in. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums, and we are glad to have you with us for this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home here, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium and the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We're also streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where you can see any of our previous History is Lunch programs at any time, and so we'd encourage you to go check those out as we wrap up our final History is Lunch for 2025. We hope that you will join us this Saturday, December 13th, over at the Eudora Welty House and Garden for their holiday open house from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m., beginning with Christmas carols sung by McWillie Elementary School's Performing Arts. There'll be flash tours and a children's craft offered alongside several vendors that'll be on site. This is a family-friendly event. It is totally free to the public, and it is going to conclude with another incredible screening on the Welty lawn with the Muppets A Christmas Carol. So if you're looking for something to do with your family this weekend, or just want to go and enjoy a wonderful evening, bundle up. It looks like it might be a little chilly, but come and enjoy that time over at the Eudora Welty House and Garden. But today we are incredibly excited as we get to wrap up our final History is Lunch for 2025 with Justin Randolph and his presentation, The Force of Law, Policing and Resistance in Jim Crow, Mississippi. Justin Randolph is a historian of 19th and 20th century U.S. history at Texas A&M University, whose work explores policing, reform, and racial justice in the American South. His book, Mississippi Law, Policing and Reform in America's Jim Crow Countryside, 2025, examines the evolution of white supremacist policing and black freedom struggles right here in Mississippi. His broader research includes studies on police desegregation, rural debt peonage, and the Taser, and 911, with publications in both academic and public outlets such as the Journal of Southern History and the Washington Post. Justin is committed to mentoring students interested in history and public scholarship. So please help me give Justin Randolph a warm round of applause as we welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. History is Lunch is such a special place to me as a researcher at the State Archives. I came over here frequently, so it's good to actually be on this side of things today. Many thanks to Brother Rogers. Brother, you just happen to be here today now. Brother has been such a point of connection for me over the years as this project, and I just want to extend thanks to him and Drew for making this possible. And also I want to thank the great archivists at the State Archives who I name in the acknowledgement section of my book. And I want to name them here: Clint Bagley, Jeff Jambroni, Denisha Layton, and William Thompson, some really great archivists over there helping people do wonderful work. I'll be speaking to you today, as Drew said, from material from my book, Mississippi Law, Police and Reform and America's Jim Crow Countryside. I will say, though, that this is a bit of an intimidating forum. I know that there are frequently veterans of the movement in here, folks who know so much about this history, so I've been a bit nervous about what I could say and add to such a rich conversation that I know transpires here every week. And I've decided, though, to pull something small from chapter 5 of the book, and I want to model for you something that historians do every day, which is to just turn to a page in the newspaper. And today is May 8th, 1954, and this is the headlines you would have seen in Gulfport's and Biloxi's Daily Herald. East-West talks on war in Indochina open today. Anybody want to translate that for our modern ears? What war do you think that would be? The Vietnam War, someone said, right? So this is the beginning in 1954. The French have just lost control or are losing control of their colony in Vietnam, and there are fears that there are going to be other powers drawn into the war, right? That the United States, for instance, might be drawn in. There are also humorous headlines of the day: Hillbilly Day to be marked in Meridian, sort of cast off. And then some rather serious sort of looming things on the agenda. NAACP leader says segregation is on the way out. Here we are on May 8th. That's just 9 days 9 days before the U.S. Supreme Court's going to rule in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation is unconstitutional. And so I want us to think sort of, if we put ourselves in May 8th, we can't see what's coming, right? We can't even see that in 9 days, as Thurgood Marshall is saying, that segregation is going to be on the way out. We can't really see that in 10 years the United States is going to join the war in Vietnam, right? We don't know that yet. And something else that's happening on this day, and this is my point, I hope this will be sort of new or a reminder to us all. Here's another headline: Jackson mayor against gas chamber in city. Mayor Alan Thompson is against location of the state's gas chamber in Jackson and said the city's commission should investigate legality of the move. Thompson said yesterday the city had no idea whatsoever when the gas chamber bill was passed that it would be located in Jackson. The 1954 legislature authorized use of lethal gas instead of electrocution for condemned criminals and stipulated the chamber be located on state lands in Hinds County. Does anybody in the room remember this moment? I have succeeded. And I want to sort of build this out for you. Anybody, where would you think it might have been if they put it in Jackson? Any ideas? The courthouse, not a bad guess. In fact, the old DPS Highway Patrol headquarters on Woodrow Wilson Avenue. Now, spoiler alert, this did not occur. They installed the gas chamber at Parchman at the penitentiary, where it functioned between 1955 and 1989, with a brief pause in the 1970s. If we remember, the death penalty was actually unconstitutional in the United States for a little bit in the 1970s. But there was a massive back and forth between state and local officials. Alan Thompson and Governor Hugh White were sort of the two people sparring. The mayor was afraid, you might think of this as like original, not in my backyard activism, sort of NIMBYism. This would have been rather close to Bellhaven, a very wealthy neighborhood, white neighborhood at the time. They didn't want this sort of thing in the neighborhood. On the other side, Hugh White was more worried about the security of the death penalty, and that's going to be a major theme of this talk, the security that is so important to some folks in the state, especially security and control over legitimate violence, as opposed to, say, illegitimate violence, like lynching, which is very much on the minds of people at this moment. And that sort of tension around security, I think, built law enforcement up over the course of the 1950s especially, and that's the law enforcement that will be inherited by the freedom movement once we get into the 1960s. So around sort of clockwise, we've got SNCC using an image from the Oxford riot in 1962 asking a provocative question of the state trooper: is he protecting you? We have a picture taken by the FBI of Fannie Lou Hamer after her attack in the Montgomery County Jail in 1963. Down bottom, we've got Stokely Carmichael in one of his many arrests. Who knows what he was said to have done in these days, but highway patrolman doing that. And then bottom left, we have student activists after the Jackson State killings in 1970, memorializing Philip Gibbs and James Green. Also, lives taken by the highway patrol. So, I want us to think about how, when I say, and it's surprising to you that the death chamber was almost in Jackson and almost in the police headquarters, like why that would seem odd to us. And I want to sort of challenge for us the idea that there is that sort of strange common sense that the death penalty is owned by prisons and not the police in that kind of way. Because by the end of my talk today, I hope, and today is actually, if you didn't know, International Human Rights Day, I hope I can show the roots of the logic that almost put the death chamber in state police headquarters, and I'll show other places where this thinking was successful in steering police policy, and showcase some of Mississippi's bold campaigns to rethink policing as a vehicle for something more than pain and more than death, especially for black folks in the state. But to do that, I'm going to need to sort of introduce you to a cast of characters that I call police expansionists. So in the middle here we have Hugh White. He's the governor who wants to put the death chamber in Jackson. To his left, the JC is J.P. Coleman. Coleman is actually at the time, is the district attorney for Hugh White, and he'll go on to be the governor after White. And then on the far left is someone named Paul B. Johnson, Jr., another governor who will take office in 1964. And together, these men really did a lot to expand the state police and expand formal police powers in the state. They were what people at the time would have referred to as racial moderates or smart segregationists. That is, they were absolutely dedicated to the perpetuation of a segregated society in Mississippi, but they just thought that there was some right ways to do it and some wrong ways to do it. The right ways were the ways that the police would be involved in, and the wrong ways would be the ways that the Klan and other racial terrorists would be involved in, those extra-legal or vigilante ways of enforcing segregation. They were sort of businessmen types as well, if you think of them that way. They thought that sort of bad press violence in Mississippi was expensive, and that we had to rehabilitate the state's reputation. So I track these sorts of folks over 4 parts of the book. Now, 10 chapters sounds like a lot. I hope it's not that much. They're short chapters, around 20 pages each. But in part 1, I look at the way that the state police emerged in the first place, because state troopers haven't always been around Mississippi, it turns out. I look back all the way to 1890, when the state rewrote its constitution to create a segregated society by race, and to take voting rights from black men. Remember, black women won't get a chance to vote until later. And these police expansionists will begin to professionalize law enforcement in ways that we would recognize today. So first there's a state militia, thought of as the state troops. They'll slowly become the National Guard, and the National Guard will slowly morph into the Highway Patrol. The founder of the Highway Patrol here was a militiaman, was a National Guardsman, the person sitting on the motorcycle, and a major character in my book, a man named Thomas Butler Birdsong, Jr. And he's receiving his commission as the first commissioner of public safety in the state from Hugh White. Hugh White's early term, actually, he served twice, but he's at the middle of all of these stories. Now, as the name would suggest, the Mississippi Highway Safety Patrol was all about highway safety, at least in theory. They were going to regulate speeding. They were going to regulate drunk driving, bootlegging. And, you know, in 1938, when this is founded, there were still wagons on the roads, right? There is very much still mules and horse-drawn wagons interacting with automobiles in really complicated ways, shall we say. But as you could imagine, or maybe you experienced yourself if you were alive in this time, during segregation, the Highway Patrol was a segregationist police force. It was all white, and black Mississippians alleged racist discrimination from the beginning. We're going to sub out my mic here. Oh, leave it on? Okay. Thanks, Drew. So it might be harder to believe, though, that at the time... Keep going. Okay. It might be harder to imagine today, but in Mississippi, the white population was also a bit split on the question of the Highway Patrol. They did not know for a fact that they wanted to be policed by a new set of policemen that had interesting sort of powers different from a sheriff and a sheriff's deputy. And so that really became a part of this history. How did the patrol grow? What powers did it have? I mean, I can give you some numbers. In its first 5 years, it interacted with over 500,000 individuals, right? Wrote some 45,000 tickets. Right? You can imagine how that's going to change the way people are thinking about it. And some white Mississippians in particular did not like the Highway Patrol's particular brand of law and order. So in 1941, Birdsong's going to ask for more police powers. He's going to think of the Highway Patrol as doing more than just policing the roads, and he's going to think about them becoming something like investigators or detectives. And this is actually something that pushes some people in the state over the edge. So this is H. Ray Bonney. He's the editor of the Macomb Daily Journal. He's a white man, and he writes, "We do not need a Gestapo or a set of stormtroopers," referring to the state troopers, roaming the state ready to pounce on our citizens for crimes or misdemeanors. Our police and our sheriffs and their deputies are equipped to handle their end of the deal in their various localities. Let's let Hitler and Himmler have exclusive rights to the stormtroopers, right? So an implicit, if not explicit, comparison of the Highway Patrol to fascists, Nazi fascists in Europe, and this being made by a white man. Now, it might have been heroic if he was actually thinking about black Mississippians in the period and the way the black Mississippians were encountering the Highway Patrol and other sheriffs, deputies, and the like, but he's almost certainly talking about the way that white people did. But in the book, I draw attention to people like Buford and Bessie Johnson, NAACP activists from Kemper County, in the late 1940s, contemporaries of Medgar Evers who were organizing with him as well. And in Kemper County, the Johnson family sort of starts their branch of the NAACP in very soon after a sheriff kills a black farmer and takes the land through various legal schemes, right, and eventually gives the land to his children. So these are the sorts of ways that law enforcement are working themselves out in Jim Crow Mississippi and the way that black Mississippians are organizing against it. But of course, we know what's coming as we get caught up to 1954. Court-ordered desegregation in the state invigorated black freedom movements across the state. Statewide leaguers like Medgar Evers and T.R.M. Howard in Mound Bayou and Emmett and Flora Stringer in Columbus. This is a period when they all sort of come into their own. And of course, there was a violent backlash to this that came to be called massive white resistance to desegregation. The White Citizens Councils, which you've maybe heard about, they joined traditional racial violence, old school murder, to really make activism for desegregation difficult. Men like George Lee, Lamar Smith, Clinton Melton all died in these years because their murderers believed they threatened white power in the state just because they were advocating for voting rights and desegregation. And Emmett Till, of course, also comes in this period. I won't rehash the details for you, but of course Emmett Till, a 14-year-old, is murdered on a trip to Mississippi from Chicago, and his murderers make it very clear that they're doing so because they're afraid that black people will control the government, as the murderers say in a famous magazine interview. And I want to note, though, why it's important to our story is that if you see here, murder, White says, that's Governor Hugh White, and promises prosecution, right? So these police expansionists are going to have a very particular response to Emmett Till's murder and the activism that's generated after it. And if you think of who comes next in our line of governors, here's Hugh White seated at the inauguration of J.P. Coleman in 1956. We're going to see a new turn to sort of more state-based control of law enforcement, and police especially is going to become important to these new people who are trying to keep segregation but keep it in a certain way. So at his inauguration in 1956, J.P. Coleman calls for good government and honest law enforcement. He promised that, quote, during the next 4 years, the full weight of the government will be unfailingly used to the end that Mississippi will be a state of law and not of violence, right? So here on the heels of the Till murder, right, we have people needing to make public stands that there's going to be something done that's not going to require federal intervention. You know, we can take care of it here, and Coleman really embodies that. I think of him as a police reformer because he does do a lot, as I'm about to say, but he starts to define police reform as police expansion, right? So better policing in this mindset means more police with more funding and more weaponry, right? That's a particular vision that's going to take hold in this time. So what does he do? He, of course, creates the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, which is a watchdog agency with sort of bizarre connections to formal law enforcement. It's a legally dubious situation, to be sure. He also, though, passes a law that would allow the state government and voters to recall sheriffs, which, if you know anything about the power of sheriffs, would be quite revolutionary, right? So if you do have a bad sheriff, right, he's passing a law saying that you can get rid of them. He grows the highway patrol by 20%. And he appoints new commissioners of public safety and the superintendent of the state penitentiary. And they're both cattlemen. If in the Q&A you want to hear about the peculiar sort of role that beef cattle and the agricultural economy plays in this, I'd be happy to say. But in this age, we're getting new sort of agribusinessmen brought into the government. We're not like using cotton planters anymore, right? Here we have cattlemen who are coming in charge and have a particular vision of what the government can be. And that brings us now into the age of the traditional civil rights movement, this age that I call an age of revolt in the book. This is the landscape inherited by the high tide of civil rights, people like the Freedom Riders and at the desegregation of the University of Mississippi, and someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who is, of course, attacked by a highway patrolman in the Montgomery County Jail in 1963. The roads and the highways traveled by civil rights volunteers and local people became key sites of pro-democracy activism and also sites to be criminalized by this Jim Crow police force. In 1964, we have like a major turn in the history of the police in Mississippi through Paul B. Johnson Jr. Paul B. Johnson Jr. is actually at the Oxford riot. He's photographed very prominently, sort of putting his fists up, trying to block the desegregation of James Meredith as he's surrounded by federal officials, and right behind him is a state trooper, right? And he sort of launches his political career on that. And when he gets in office in 1964, he, more than anyone, really builds out the highway patrol. And here's Birdsong also. He's been around since 1938, right? So he basically works in the highway patrol for 50 years, on and off. But in office, Johnson will triple the patrol. He'll grant them, through the legislature, conditional statewide jurisdiction, the thing that got them called Nazis in the 1940s. Suddenly, in the 1960s, it's okay. And he'll build a training academy, too, that's still there, for troopers where they can teach other people in the state, especially sheriff's deputies and sheriffs and local cops, how to be like them, how to be like troopers. I want to read you a couple things he says at the big moment where he launches this new highway patrol in the fall of 1964. If you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan now, or if you plan to join, the best thing for you to do is to get your hat and leave, he said. So, okay, he's not for the Klan being part of the state police. He also said this: we've got some visitors in our state, talking about freedom riders and people like that, that are not the type that have come here for outdoor camping purposes. We expect to see that they are checked not once, but 12 and 15 times a day. Their position should be a position that is uncomfortable. Bad brakes, bad windshield wipers. Hades is not hot compared to what we want it to be for some of these people. And if you have to kill a man, you can be certain that if it's done in self-defense, you'll have a pardon from the state penitentiary before you get there. Okay. So the Klan's bad, but also you all can do whatever you want, right? And also we expect you basically to make civil rights activists in the state very uncomfortable. Well, we know what happens during Freedom Summer of 1964, the Mississippi burning case. I've got a chapter on in my book. I really focus in on the role that the police actually played in the Freedom Summer murders. If you think about it, of course, Cecil Ray Price is a deputy sheriff who arrests the three men, James Earl Chaney from Meridian, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. He arrests them and turns them over to the Klan, but it's mainly remembered as a Klan murder, as a terrorist plot. But in the aftermath of the murders, the survivors and their loved ones, like you have here, Mrs. Fannie Lee Chaney, eulogizing her son over the ruins of the Mount Zion Methodist Church, they actually have a more robust movement than I think historians often remember, and they put the police at the center. So a case I want to tell you about is the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, v. Lawrence A. Rainey. It was a class action lawsuit with plaintiffs that included activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, Bob Moses, Reverend Ed King. The defendants in this case were Lawrence A. Rainey, the sheriff of Neshoba County, and many more people, including the Ku Klux Klan, the Citizens Council, and importantly, every law enforcement agency and officer in the state. Right? So they formulated a lawsuit that would actually implicate all of law enforcement in Mississippi, and their hopes were to block local Mississippi law enforcement from policing the civil rights movement, and to set up federal court police officers, magistrates they were actually called, to enforce the law instead. Right? So they had a bold sort of imagination of sort of pausing the Jim Crow policing that they had known forever and thinking about what something new could be in this moment. And the lawsuit's lead plaintiff was actually Fannie Lee Chaney. She joined a national speaking tour that accompanied the case, and in her eulogy over the ruins of Mount Zion, she says, quote, "You all know what my son has done. He was trying for us all to make a better living. I just don't want those children's work to be in vain. I want to know if somebody is going to help me. If we're going to do something, we'd better try it now. They're dead. Don't let their work die." That's when freedom started. And as lawsuits go, as you could imagine, this lawsuit not very successful. Like a federal court judge actually sort of on the day it arrives says, no, this isn't going to happen. Too broad, too many people. You can't suspend law enforcement in Mississippi. But the Court of Appeals actually picks it up, and the activists used this case as a massive organizing spree to get affidavits and testimony about the policing that they encountered during Freedom Summer. And they end up publishing a book called Mississippi Black Paper. It's just in the museum. You can get testimonies pulled from this book in the museum. But the testimonies in Mississippi Black Paper only exist because of COFO v. Rainey. Right? It's actually 57 of some over 200 affidavits that were just about police brutality in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. Now, the bold vision that they had in COFO v. Rainey, of course, does not win the day. In fact, there's not really even a moment to consider what role the police that were in office during Jim Crow would have during the next phase that we might call desegregation. Instead, the Highway Patrol is very much propped up as being an important piece of what law enforcement will look at. If you know Jerry Mitchell's excellent work on the Freedom Summer murders, he shows that it's actually a highway patrolman that tells the FBI where to find the bodies, and you know, through that way can begin their investigation. So the Highway Patrol is thought to be, by many people, Lyndon Johnson included, you know, is thought to have the best reputation of law enforcement in the state. But just a year later, the Highway Patrol is going to really implicate itself in another form of law enforcement that's not so laudable. The Fairground Stockade case of the summer of 1965, where Jackson Police and State Patrol take over 400 black and white protesters to the state fairgrounds in in a place that was previously used to hold cattle, where there's everything, all sorts of torture reported by activists, sleep deprivation, routine beatings. One activist was even forced to chew on their SNCC button, if you can imagine how terrible that would be. A nurse with the Medical Committee for Human Rights reported that by June 21st, 2 protesters who were pregnant before they got there had miscarried. Right? This was the condition sort of created by the state police. And here they are loading folks into a trash wagon, actually. Now, while the stockade affair is playing out, that one of those police expansionists comes back into the news. J.P. Coleman, the former governor, is actually appointed to a lifelong post on the Court of Appeals as a federal judge, if you can imagine. So Lyndon Johnson actually makes that appointment, and it places many activists besides themselves, to put it frankly. They rush to Washington to testify against the decision, but Coleman wins the fight, and LBJ very much wants him to be a judge, a segregationist made into a judge. And, you know, if we think about what could have been going on in LBJ's mind when he's making a decision like that, we can very easily imagine, right? This is trying to keep the South in the Democratic Party, trying to keep Mississippi in the Democratic Party. So you're going to keep someone like J.P. Coleman into that post. But, you know, my research suggests that liberals like Lyndon Johnson had more in common with Jim Crow segregationists like Coleman than just the National Party on some questions. They certainly disagreed on a lot, and I don't want to overstate it. They disagreed on important things. But if you think of something like, you know, if I can make one last move to May 8th, 1954, right? Lyndon Johnson is also the president, signs the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and commits American troops to the war in Vietnam. And beyond the parties of these two men, I think more fundamentally on the ideas of security, control, and specifically how much collateral damage would be acceptable in the pursuit of a certain vision of public safety. The stories that I tell in Mississippi Law sort of resonate a bit more with stories happening across America and across the world. So at the same time that Mississippians are being loaded into cattle cages at the state fairgrounds, the U.S. military is using napalm in the Republic of Vietnam, right? Somewhat indiscriminately, pretty difficult to control the violence that you're unleashing in your fight, in this case, against the global spread of communism. This is the sort of collateral damage that I mean to sort of draw our minds to, right? At the same time, at Parchman, guards are using cattle prods to control prisoners, right? What's the commonality here? What's the violence that everyone has an appetite for or can allow to be? And Vietnam, in important ways, crashes onto the streets of Jackson again in May 1970. Of course, the protesters who are fired upon by the Highway Patrol are fired upon because they're protesting several things, but a major thing they're protesting is the war in Vietnam, the extension of the draft, the expansion of the war in this case, by Richard Nixon into other countries in Southeast Asia, beyond Vietnam. So these are the things that drive students to protest. Also, the police violence that's still plaguing Jackson State's campus, and white motorists who were speeding through campus attempting to hit black students without any sort of accountability or law enforcement happening. So when the troopers fire upon for 30 seconds, right, this unarmed crowd of students, killing 2 and wounding many others, they have weaponry, right? They have armor-piercing bullets They have submachine guns and buckshot that are provided to them, in fact, by the Lyndon Johnson liberal government, right? Systems that are pumping federal funds into policing that they think they can trust, right? So I think that we see in 1970 a moment where we don't have yet a full accounting of what activists saw in Kofo v. Rainey, right? What they were trying to draw our attention to the wider violence of law enforcement that was possible, the kind of violence that, you know, could be epitomized by the state police getting control of the death penalty in 1954. But to end, I want to draw us to one final voice, someone who saw this in Mississippi, Elijah Pierce. Does anyone know the work of Elijah Pierce? He's a woodcut artist. He got his start as a whittler. He's a Mississippian who joined the Great Migration after a run-in with the police himself in Tupelo, as it turns out. But he spent most of his life in Columbus, Ohio, and I actually encountered his art at the Columbus Museum of Art in Ohio when I lived there briefly. I couldn't imagine the overlap. But if you see in a piece of art like this, Watergate, of course, there's referring to Richard Nixon here in the building, the government building. But for him, Watergate is so much more, right? The corruption of government is so much more. We've got warplanes, we've got tanks, and we've got Jackson State and Kent State here portrayed too. And one of the quotes that I'm always drawn to with Elijah Pierce is this one. He told a reporter once, quote, "There's more killing and slaughtering and hatred in the human heart now than there ever was in history." Now, that's a pretty bleak assessment, I'll say. He went on to say, "These nations now, they're just saying peace, but going back and making ammunition and missiles and every other device." Right, so I think Elijah Pierce would say, beware the claims of peace that come to us wrapped in the powers of war. Okay. Thank you. I really look forward to the Q&A, and thanks for your attention.
Justin, as we get started with questions, can you tell us a little bit, you spent a lot of time over next door at the archives. Talk to us a little bit about some of the most interesting things you found in our archives next door.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Drew. I mean, so much of this work is made possible by it. You know, the Highway Patrol doesn't have a lot of publicly accessible archives, so I was a bit disappointed by that, but the earlier stuff, so this image is actually from the state archives. It's the original coat of arms. You might have thought that the state had the coat of arms forever and always. They didn't. They created this coat of arms at the same time they created the state flag that had the Confederate battle emblem in it, right? So 1894. And of course the words mean virtue in arms, right? This sort of armed virtue that's possible this way. But, you know, on the other side, I want to draw attention to the Johnson family, right? Without the Medgar Evers papers, for instance, I wouldn't have been able to draw the full picture to just like, you know, what people are doing in very profoundly rural Kemper County to build connections with movement people across the state.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I was born on a plantation, and I remember leaving that plantation. I vaguely remember the owners, but that kind of the mentality that you're talking about, at what point, like the Epstein thing, the strong passion for whatever it is that's in your head, and to have it, it's wide open now. No one in this room is constrained, but the hatred, at what point? I mean, it's you would put me away if I could jump off a building and run around yelling buck naked and everything like that. You know that something is wrong. The perpetrator may not know nor care, but something is wrong. And then my last point, President Obama was on a talk show, I think it may have been Saturday Night Live, and he was being interviewed by one of those brilliant young people. And in the middle of the conversation, she stopped and said, "If you become president, are you going to put us into slavery?" and he didn't know what to do. He just fell back and said, "No, I'm not." Is that the fear?
Yeah, I mean, it is so poignant, right? The idea that I think when you think of, if I can find the image of Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So her time after being attacked in Montgomery County, this is a picture taken by the FBI. The FBI investigates. The FBI helps file a federal lawsuit in Oxford in 1963. Obviously, the lawsuit goes nowhere, right? And that sort of allowance, saying that what police officers did to Fannie Lou Hamer and the others in the Montgomery County Jail is perfectly fine. That sort of lawlessness, that lack of accountability is at the heart of it. And yeah, it's supported at every point in the government in this period. I showed that the Supreme Court has many opportunities to intervene in this, and they don't. So, when you think of something like Kofo v. Randy and its sort of radical vision of pausing and just thinking about what we could actually do differently, given all the history, right, it really makes you appreciate what they tried to do. Thank you.
Hi. I think it's very interesting how you tie in the situation in Vietnam. But my what I've been trying to understand for a long time, because many of our friends never really understood why they were over there fighting. And it's been lots of times saying that the bottom line was drugs. And when I see what's going on today with Venezuela and the drugs, none of it makes sense. And of course, what Trump does doesn't have to make sense. It's just crazy and chaos anyway. But can you just explain some of that?
Sure. Yeah. I think what you're highlighting, sort of the chaos, just the chaos generally, right? That folks are living through and trying to figure out. Even something like after 1964 being drafted into Vietnam, and what the students at Jackson State, right? There's it's going to be a massive expansion of the draft that they're protesting against as well. As are, and I mentioned Kent State, as are students across the country. Students at Tulane University are fighting back as well. So that sort of inability to comprehend what people are calling for, on the one hand domestically as security, and then on the other hand as national security, right? Now, public safety and national security, right? That is really what I'm trying to draw our attention to. That it's there's a amount of violence that is thought to be legitimate if done for the right reasons, and activists like these at Jackson State are trying to draw our attention to other possibilities. Otherwise, thank you.
Dr. Randall, hey, your faithfulness is illuminating. Thank you. Couldn't help but wonder just the cost, the dollar cost, taxpayer dollars that went to sustaining Jim Crow in the name of security and control. Is there a study of how much then and how much it would translate into today's dollars?
This is such a fantastic question. Thank you. I try my best to piece it together. And if I had the book in front of me, I could name for you how it grew. But when you have, someone like J.P. Coleman expanding the patrol like he did, you will see the state allotments like spiking up dramatically. And even after Jackson State, they give massive influxes of state funds, to say nothing of federal funds, to these institutions. And it really is a march towards, if you look at most budgets today, locally and statewide, public safety is going to be a massive chunk, right? And I think the movement also asks us to sort of think about other ways that money could be spent. COFO v. Rainey does not say that we need a massive sort of cop hiring program, right? They're not thinking in those terms at all. And in fact, someone like Fannie Lee Cheney is doing the work that she's doing with the lawsuit and speaking from a place of, unimaginable pain, while also helping build the COFO Freedom House in Meridian, which is a space to give out clothes, food, vitamins, that kind of thing. So I'm sorry that I don't have the numbers, but you can rest assured that it's a massive spike. And it's really, it's something that actually, if you think back like to sort of a more conservative mindset, right, where the state is shrunk, right, that sort of logic of like keeping the budget low, like, is thrown out when it gets to this. Thank you.
This gets a little philosophical, but thinking about Elijah Pierce, there's always a conflict between the concept of sovereignty and the concept of democracy. That somebody's in sovereignty, somebody's in charge, and everybody else is not. Democracy, there's a equality across levels of sovereignty. For the police in all of this, and this goes back to the notion, are they a protection source? Is it feasible to have a police force that is not simply a police force that's protecting sovereignty rather than democracy?
This is a very philosophical question. I will say that people at the time certainly hoped that it could be, right? And I don't think there's any doubt people in COFO v. Rainey did not imagine that police officers were going to vanish, right? That law enforcement officers were going to disappear from their community. They thought, though, about what it would mean to have like a more fundamental, I think, democratic control over the police. And part of that, as a historian, I think, is, can you see what the police did in the past? Do you have access? Do you, me, us, do we have access to the records, the historical records of what the police did in the past? And so here's a story that I got from MDAH. We all know the Sovereignty Commission. We all know the fight for the Sovereignty Commission records. It's like an epic win for like pro-democracy activists everywhere. There's a great exhibit in the museum where they've got the filing cabinets that were all taped up. If you don't know, the Sovereignty Commission records were almost destroyed, were almost burned, but for some really swift movement to preserve them, and before long they were released to the public, and now they're digitized and everyone can see them. The same lawsuit that got the Sovereignty Commission papers released also originally included the Highway Patrol records. The Highway Patrol records very quickly dropped out. A judge said, no, the Freedom of Information Act, disqualifies police records. We can't have them. So I think truly in a society looking at these weighty philosophical questions of what do we want public safety to look like in our everyday lives now, I think the only way we can truly have that conversation is to have full access to the records of what happened in the past and how the police acted in the past. And there are plenty of people who can tell you firsthand. You don't need to see the police records for everything, but in some ways it would be incredibly helpful to see those records as well. So hopefully it's not a cop-out. I'd say get all the records.
I have a question about the use of history. That generally we look at history and study it so that we don't commit the mistakes of the past. Comparing what has taken place in your presentation in Mississippi in the 50s and 60s and 70s to your home state now of Texas, what Abbott is doing, what Paxton is doing, the attack on the immigrants down on the Rio Grande, where they put the barriers in the river to hurt them, and all the other things that they've done. What did you learn? What can you tell us about what you learned studying Mississippi in that period of time compared to what's going on in Texas today?
Yeah, so much. I mean, I've been teaching over in Texas over the life of this book, in some ways over its creation. And one thing that really struck me early on, and let me find a picture of Birdsong as a younger man. Thomas Butler Birdsong, what I'm about to say, or the argument of what I'm about to say, is that there are sort of cyclical motions of history that we should be attuned to. And I don't mean like the same thing repeating and repeating, but just where people go and how they come through the past. So T.B. Birdsong was a militiaman, a National Guardsman, and he actually got his start at the U.S.-Mexico border during World War I. He was sent there to help militarize it. If you think of Pancho Villa and the sort of cross-border raids of the Mexican Revolution. So Birdsong goes as a National Guardsman first to Texas. And when he comes back to found the state police, he has agents of the Highway Patrol in Texas help train them in Mississippi. So that sort of border battle happening there, which we know for a fact mainly included policing, in this case, Mexican-American people in South Texas, and yes, chasing after some bandits crossing the border. That sort of work came back with him to Mississippi, and that what historians refer to as counterinsurgency work sort of happened as well. So I don't have an answer to the problems that you've named, but I will say that if we turn our mind to sort of seeing the connections between a state like Mississippi and a place like the border in Texas that we think of as two separate zones, we actually see that people are going both ways. And another strange thing about Birdsong, and I'm thinking about writing something on this, is he actually goes to China after World War II to help fight against the communist revolution in China in the 1940s. So he actually gets a medal from Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader of China, for going and doing something that I haven't truly been able to find record of yet. So deep connections there between Mississippi, China, and Texas.
My question is, with your study from the archives and specifically with the Highway Patrol and the things that were happening since 1938, the 50s, 60s, and the 70s until today, and we had a big fight over Capitol Police taking over City of Jackson, part City of Jackson, Jackson Police. We have the State Patrol that's right up the street. We still have the governor of Mississippi in control of who is the commissioner of public safety. How much do you think that the Highway Patrol has changed since that time? And even with the sheriff, the Highway Patrol having an academy to train other law enforcement agencies and things like this, and we still have incident like the sheriff and the incident in Rankin County. We just had a big thing with FBI sting of several law enforcement in North Mississippi. How much do you think that it has changed in respect to what was happening then?
Yeah, Thank you. It's such a huge question. I'll take it sort of small pieces if I can. So one thing is that activists at the time really thought about was changing its complexion, changing the people who participated in the Highway Patrol. The Highway Patrol was all white until 1972. Okay, so I do think when we think of sort of the timeline of desegregation in Mississippi, I heard recently, school desegregation, 1969, 1971. Well, I think there is like a one later step with that that's pretty important for us to remember, which is the state police, which is 1972. It required a massive lawsuit from Constance Slaughter Harvey, a notable lawyer in the state, to accomplish, and it came right after the Jackson State killings. You don't get the Jackson State killings, or you don't get desegregation without the Jackson State killings in at least the way that it happened. So activists had hopes for desegregation bringing about a great deal of change. It certainly changed it in some ways. The control of the patrol that you described is very much largely the same. It is a very top-down structure emanating from a very powerful commissioner of public safety. And the politics, everything changes, but, some of the same logics and themes play out. So I do think of, the way that the patrol and the state police is thinking about expanding and has expanded into Jackson to police Jackson and sort of in various ways subvert the traditional jurisdiction of JPD, right, is very similar to the way that they encroached on sheriff's jurisdictions in the 40s and 50s. I do think that's a common theme. And you are absolutely right about the training academy. In the book ends, I couldn't end without thinking a little bit about the Rankin County situation, because it was really exploding into the news as I was sort of putting the finishing touches on the book. Jerry Mitchell's amazing work and the team at Mississippi Today is really to thank for that. So many of the officers had been to, if not the Highway Patrol Academy, the FBI Academy, right? So to say that folks were not trained, right, that they had not taken advantage of training before they did these things, right, that would be misguided. And I think that actually, some of the cases in the book that I look at where activists are thinking beyond just desegregation and beyond just training. Right? I look at a case in Marshall County in Holly Springs where activists actually say, well, there's continued to be police brutality here, so we're going to ask that one of these federal grants is actually put on hold until we see some actual steps towards correcting the behavior that our community wants to see. So that was there.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I know we probably still have a few more questions in the room, but we're right here closing in on the top of the hour. And so let's give Justin another round of applause. Justin's book, Mississippi Law, is phenomenal. It is an excellent read. It's not a long read by any means, and so I highly recommend if you would like to purchase a copy. We have a number of them just to the left of the stage, and Justin would be happy to sign that copy for you. If you have more questions and you'd like to ask Justin, come, and he'll kind of be hanging around this front table. He'll sign your copy, answer any questions that you have while he's here and available. I want to thank everybody as we wrap up History's Lunch in 2025. Just thank you for everybody who has attended so far this year, who's watched online, and the staff that have helped make this program possible. We've had nearly 4,000 people come through History's Lunch in 2025, and many of you are dedicated participants that come every week to support our speakers and our programs, and we're incredibly thankful for each of you in this long tradition that's begun. The program has begun long before this building was ever built, and so we're very thankful for you all, and we hope that you'll come back and join us on January 14th, 2026. as we invite Aram Goodzuzan and his book, Down the Crossroads, as we kick off 2026. So thank you guys so much. You'll have a wonderful rest of the year, and happy holidays. Thank you guys.